Okay, gentlemen, welcome to part two, module number 2 of Laws of War of Hilchot Milchama and IBC. And today we'll be learning about the responsibility of going to war. Whose responsibility is it to take us to war? When I was getting married, an elderly rabbi in the community gave me a sage piece of advice. He said, in your home, for Shalom Bayis, you should know there are rules. You get to make all the big decisions, and your wife will make the small ones. You get to decide if we go to war with Russia, if we raise taxes, if we nuke Iran. The big decisions are for you to make. But the little ones, like where we go for Shabbos, what we're having for dinner, where we go shopping, that's for your wife to decide. Sage advice indeed. But now that we're discussing Hilchot Milchama, I don't think he anticipated that this would be the question that I'm posing. I guess the answer is already known. But just to ask you and perhaps prove to you what the halacha is about about the milchama, about these halachot. Who exactly is responsible for the milchama? And that is what I want to discuss today. So, whose responsibility is it to take the Jewish people to war? And I'll give you a hint. It's not me. It's the Jewish king. It's the Melech. Melech Yisrael is the arbiter in charge of taking the nation to war. And I want to prove it to you. The Rambam, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, wrote a sefer called Mishneh Torah, the Yad HaChazakah, the Code of Jewish Law. And in it he wrote a number of chapters, a number of sections. Each book of the 14 books, has a number of sections. Ahava has Hilchot Berachot and Milah, and Cheryat Shema and Tefillah, Zimanim as Shabbat and Yom Tov, Yom Kippurim, etc. And when you get to Sefer Mishpatim, the book of laws, of legislation, where he talks about Hilchot Sanhedrin, Hilchot Edut, he also talks about this thing in the very end called Hilchot Milachim, O Milchamotehem, the laws of kings and their wars. It could not be more explicit that the Rambam already sees the king as a legislative body, a legislative entity, as being the one responsible for wars. And I want to show you today how the Rambam says that so nicely throughout the 12 or so chapters of Hilchot Melachim. Let's go through together an outline. The first chapter of Hilchot Melachim discusses the mitzvah of appointing a king. Who can be a king, how we appoint a king, and the like. Once we have a king, we have to honor him. We have to give him the respect that he deserves as the leader of the Jewish people. And he discusses the kavod of the king, how we have to interact with the king. After that, the king is a king now. He has to live like a king. He has mitzvot that he has to follow. He has to make sure he writes his own Sefer Torah and takes it with him wherever he goes. He can't have too many wives. He can't have too much money. He can't have too many horses, because all these things could be grand distractions from the goal of running the country. Number 4, he has legislative powers. He can levy taxes. He can force you to work for him and force labor. Number 5, he can send you to war. And there are certain wars that he can fight and other wars that he cannot fight. And we have to discuss that as well. Then there are the general laws of war. Once we're talking about wars with the king, well, what do we do at war? What are the laws of war? Besieging enemy territory and the like. This is where it's discussed. Then once we're going to war, there's in the parasha we talk about the Meshuach Melchama, the Kohen, who stands up and raises the morale of the people and makes sure that everyone is on board, and we send back those who should not be fighting. We have the halachot in enemy territory, engaging with the enemy on a personal level in terms of kashrut and yifat toar. And then once we're talking about the yifat toar and bringing her home, and maybe we convert her to Judaism. Well, if she's not going to convert to Judaism, so then she has to die unless she becomes a Ger Toshav. Ger Toshav is somebody who follows the 7 mitzvot b'nei Noach, and there are 2 perakim on the topic. And after all that, the Rambam decides to chuck in some halachot of Melech HaMashiach. So I want to go with you today, briefly, no doubt, through some of the halachot of the Rambam in Hilchot Melachim. And I want to discuss Be'ezrat Hashem some of that today. Just one moment, please. Oh, wrong screen. Okay. I want to discuss some of that today to go through briefly the halachot of Milchama. Just bear with me one moment. I want to make sure I have the right things open. Okay. I hope you can see the screen, the Sefaria screen. Quickly, we're gonna race through this. But the Rambam begins his discussion of the laws of kings, the three mitzvot the Jewish people were commanded when they enter the city, and they enter Eretz Yisrael. This week's parasha, Som Tasim Alecha Melech. That you should have. I'm just gonna leave that open. It's annoying. Whatever you should set for yourself, appoint for yourself a king, and then afterwards you have to eradicate Amalek and build the Beit Hamikdash. So the Rambam discusses how that the first thing you have to do is appoint the king. That's the first mitzvah you have to do. And you need a Beit Din of Shiv'im ve'echad. You need to have 71 zikenim, a Sanhedrin Gedola, essentially, and a Navi. Just like Yoshua was appointed by Moshe Rabbeinu and his Beit Din, Shaul and David by Shemuel, etc. We can't have a ger be a king. Oops, sorry. We can't have a ger be a king. We can't have a woman be a king, based on the different derashot of the Pisukim. It can't be a Kohen Gadol either. Sorry, you can't have anybody who is a ger be anyone who is of a not lofty stature be put in a position of melucha, not be appropriate. It's a status of honor. And a king needs Meshicha b'Shemen HaMishcha or b'Shemen HaFarsimon, depending on the type of king, whether it be Malchut Beit David or otherwise. He needs to be anointed. And the means of coronating the king is a significant thing. And we'll come back to this Be'ezrat Hashem. Let's see, what else do we need here? So here we go. Navi shehamid melech mishar shiftei Yisrael. We're going to come reference this again later. I just want to go through it together now. A Navi who appoints a king from another shevet. Not Beit David. If that king acts properly like he should and following the ways of Hashem, that's a great king. And he has to be treated like a king, as all the mitzvot of Malchus. Malchus the David, even though the primary Malchut would be for David, anyone from David's family could become the next king. Still, there are circumstances in which another king can be appointed. Ideally, the kingdom rests in the family of David HaMelech. But there are some times in history where it has been needed that another king from another shevet be put. Shaul or Yarovam. That is significant. And remember that line about following in the mitzvahs of Hashem. We're going to come back to that Be'ezrat Hashem. Now, there's Malchi Beit David, a little bit different. Fine. Inyan Meshicha now. Kavod Gadol Nohagim B'Melech. The king needs special, major honor. And everybody, we have to implant awe and fear in the hearts of everybody. Som tasim, that sheteh emato alecha. That you should fear him. You can't use his stuff. You have to give him tremendous honor. Now, you can't see him when he's in a disgraceful position. There are laws of how he conducts himself and other mitzvot as well. He always has to get a haircut every day. Fine, but certainly when it comes to Lomdei Torah, he says, Lifnei Lazar Kohen Yamod, the king has to stand in front of the Kohen Gadol as well as all Chachamim. So, and when they come, he has to seat them in his thing. Fine, great. The king has to respect Lomdei Torah. So, he has to conduct himself, carry himself like a king. So, but the same way that the king is commanded and obligated to act with honor for himself, and everyone has to honor him, so too he has to be very humble. Libi halal bikirbi, be very lowly and avoid, I guess, no haughtiness amongst the Jewish people, for the king. He has to be a rachaman. He can't be achzari. He has to be very gracious. He has to be merciful, and he has to care about people, no matter who they are in his kingdom. However, he has to treat them with tremendous humility, like Moshe Rabbeinu. A Jewish king is not a despot. He's not a tyrant. He's somebody who has to see it as his role, his constant role, is to care for the people. And now, when he's the king, he has to have a Sefer Torah. In addition to the regular one, the person has to write, a king has to have his own Sefer Torah that he takes with him wherever he goes, and he's always reading it. And wherever he goes, whether it be to war or to a meeting, whatever it is, he has to take it with him. He has to always be focused on Hashem. He always has to know what the mitzvot are. He has to know what his calling is. He always has to be reviewing his raison d'etre. And on that note, he can't be distracted from his raison d'etre. His goal of serving Hashem as the king would be severely hindered if he had too many wives. As we see from Shlomo HaMelech, he can't have too many horses because that would send him back to Mitzrayim. He can't have too much money because it'll cause him to get full of pride. He has to have enough for the kingdom. Vizehu. Now, whatever, the details fine. He can't get drunk because that would also distract him from his goal. He always has to be focused on the Ribono Shel Olam. Al Hasarat Libo Hikpidat Torah. The Torah is so concerned with his distraction. Libo Hu Lev Kol Kahal Yisrael. His heart is the heart of the Jewish people. Lefichach Dibeku HaKatuv BaTorah Yeter Mishar Ha'am. Therefore, the Torah is so much more careful and concerned with him than others. Now, there's an issue of rebellion. A person rebels against the king does not need due process. The king can have him killed at any time. A person who disgraces the king certainly would also fall under that category. But you don't have to listen to this. That's if you just don't violate the law, the rules of the king. The king orders you to do something, you don't listen to his orders, then that would be mored b'malchut. But if the king orders you to break the mitzvot, to break the Torah, then you don't have to listen to that. Now, Parak 4, Parak Daled, the king has legislative power to levy taxes, to force you to go to work, and the like. Now, there's a great line here at the very end I just want to get to, that he can force you to do these things. He can set up a whole system of taxation and whatever, fine. So, and there's a whole system of spoils, and who gets to keep stuff from people who have been killed by the king. That's not really for us. Now, this is the last line here, though. The spoils, he can take whatever he wants and give to the rest. Everything he has to do, he does should be for the sake of heaven. His entire purpose and intent shall be to elevate the true faith. To fill the world with justice. To destroy the enemy powers and to fight God's wars. Why? Now this is the line. She'ein mamlichin melech techila. The whole purpose of a king is la'asot mishpat u'milchamot. Ela la'asot mishpat u'milchamot is to engage in justice and warfare. Shneimar shvatanu malkeinu v'yatza lefanenu nilcham imilchamotenu. It's abundantly clear. The role of the king is to be the chief of all wars. That is the role of the king. La'asot mishpat u'milchamot. That is the role of the king. Now, what kind of wars are we talking about? Let's discuss, Be'ezrat Hashem, briefly some of the kinds of wars that are out there. The Gemara tells us in Sotah, and the Rambam codifies in Perek Hey of Hilchot Melachim, that there are two kinds of wars. There's a milchemet mitzvah, and there's a milchemet harishut, a mitzvah war and an optional war. Milchemet mitzvah has three kinds. There is milchemet shiva amim, against the 7 Canaanite nations, and then there's the milchemet Amalek, to decimate Amalek. These two are themselves mitzvot that the Torah puts on the king. And the third one, Ezrat Yisrael miyad sar sheba alehem, to save the Jewish people from an enemy which comes to attack them. And that's milchamet mitzvah. We'll discuss the difference between that and milchamet harashut, which is purely an expansionary war, a war fought to increase the king's greatness, to expand the borders and to get lots of more wealth. Obviously, wars are fought for various reasons. All those other reasons would be called milchemet harishut. Milchemet mitzvah, the king can go on his own. He can just declare war on his own. But milchemet harishut, he has to do with the permission, consultation with the Beit Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin Hagedolah of 71 dayanim. And there are rules for how a king conducts himself at war. He doesn't have to take any shortcut. He doesn't have to take any side roads. He can go straight and as he needs, straight through any property in order to get where he has to get to. He has to destroy the 7 Canaanite nations and destroy Amalek. And whatever he conquers is considered kibush rabim if it's with Beit Din's permission. If it was without Beit Din's permission, like David HaMelech in Syria, it's called kibush yachid and doesn't have the status of Eretz Yisrael fully. So, and then the Rambam digresses to talk about Mitzrayim, and that's really our topic for today, in terms of the Rambam. Now, let's go on to Milchamet Mitzvah. There are 2 categories of war, Milchamet Mitzvah / Chova. It's Machloket Tanaim, doesn't matter for now. And the rule is that everybody must go to war. Afilu kala mitoch chupata. Whoever, you don't have any exceptions. Everyone must go to war for Milchamet Mitzvah. Whereas for Milchamet HaReshut requires permission from the Sanhedrin, as well as these exceptions. We have the Mishruach Milchama, the Kohen who gets up and starts giving people the speech. And he says, whoever built a house or got married recently or planted a vineyard or whatever has sins should go home. These people are exempt from the war because it's a Milchamet HaReshut. But if it was a Milchamet Mitzvah, then everybody has to go to war. There are no exceptions, as we'll continue discussing further later. So now this is the basics of war. I answered the question. Who is in charge of war? Not me, not every husband, kol ish sorer bebeito, but rather the king. The Jewish king is in charge of the wars. Now I ask you, it seems like we have a Milchamet Mitzvah today, right? But I think that we're clearly missing something. Before we can talk about fighting on Milchamet Mitzvah, we need to have the person to run the Milchamet Mitzvah. We don't have a king. Or do we? How can we fight a war today without a king? So Rav Kook wrote a monumental teshuvah in Shut Mishpat Kohen. People think Rav Kook was a Zionist rabbi who loved the secular Jews way too much. They forget that he was a Malach Hashem Tzvaot, in Rav Ovadiah's words. And he was a monstrous Talmid Chacham. He learned in Volozhin. He was a monstrous Talmid Chacham. He wrote many, many sefarim of all styles, of all genres. And Rav Kook writes in Mishpat Kohen, his Sheilot Utshuvot and Choshen Mishpat, Chutz mizeh nirim hadvarim shebizman she'ein melech, when there is no king, keivan shemishpetei hamelucha hem gam kema shenogeh lematzav haklali shel ha'umah. The laws of the kingdom are not just for the king; they're relevant to the entire nation. Chozrim ela hazichuyot shel hamishpatim liad ha'umah bechlala. Therefore, those rights to manage, to run the nation in times of war, in times of a kingdom, having a kingdom goes back to the nation. So any leader, any legislative leader who rises amongst the Jewish people takes upon the role of a king. Not everything. They can have 19 wives if they want. It's a stupid idea. But they don't have to have a Sefer Torah. They're allowed to get drunk from time to time. They don't have necessarily the mitzvot or the kavod of a king in the same way that the king is all powerful and can kill people without due process and the like for Moed b'malchut. But in many ways, they take upon what makes sense. Kama mishpetei hamelucha, such as going to war. Yichud l'mashno gil and hagat haklal, whatever is relevant to running a country, to managing the nation, to leading the nation. Aval Mashe Nogea, he continues later. He says it again. Whatever is needed for the nation is in his power. It's in his purview. Whatever is part of the national endeavor. Now Kook says further out, I didn't put it on the page, that this is a function of mishpetei hamelucha, whatever doesn't have to do with the king's kavod, but rather with the nation. is within the purview, within the jurisdiction of the leaders of the Jewish people. And he says that this is a function of Yari Yavor as well, protecting ourselves against Shmat as well. But I have a very important question. The Rambam said in the very beginning of Hilchot Melachim something very, very important that we're kind of missing here, right? Let's go back to, where are we? I want to go back to Perek Aleph of Hilchot Melachim. One little problem here, right? Minoi Melech Kodem L'Chaman HaMalek, right? Ein ma'amidin melech b'techila ela al pi beit din shel shiv'im zekenim ve'al pi navi. Do you have a navi? Was there a navi recently who made Netanyahu the king? You know, where do you get this king from? Where do you get a navi from? Where do you get a shiv'im zekenim from? We're missing something very important here. So, Rav Kook writes that was the chatchila, but b'di avad, you could have a king without it. And he brings many rayot from throughout Tanakh where you could get away with not having a Navi. You can get away without having a Sanhedrin. And maybe it's only Me'akev when you have a Navi. But if there is no Nevuah, then you could be Ma'amid a Melech without it. Or it could be that you only need these things when there's a competition. Such as Achia HaShiloni, with the Navi who appointed Yarovam ben Nevat against Rechavam. That's you needed a Navi in order to do that, separate from, right, the existing king, which we saw earlier about, where was it? Moshe Hashem HaMishcha. He said, Navi shehamid melech mishar shiftei Yisrael. Look, Achia did exactly this. That's what the Rambam tells us, right? Achia Shiloni had Yarovam. Doesn't even mention a Beit Din, by the way. But that might be what it's necessary for. So, but the main point Rav Kook is making is that you can have a king without a Sanhedrin. You can have a king without a Navi. And Bisman, you don't have any of that. Anybody who gets up and takes the place of a king can therefore be a king. He won't have all the halachos, but at least he'll have some of them. And he has precedence for this in Rishonim. The Meiri says this as well, that anyone who the Manhi Gador, Gedolei ha'aratzot, have the power la'anosh l'harog derech hora'at sha'a. And the Duran says in the famous derasha, Kasher lo yeh melech b'Yisrael shofet yichlol shnia kilchot. If there is no melech, then the shofet, shofetim v'shoterim, the shofet takes upon himself the other koach. Koach ha'shofet, the koach ha'melech. And Rav Kook got glowing acceptance for his view from many gedolim of his time and afterwards as well. There was a machloket. Of course, there's always a machloket. And I'm not here to tell you I know all the details. I'm not apologizing to you, but hindsight is pretty 20/20, and it seems like amongst the poseikim who deal with these issues, this is very much the accepted view today. He got glowing acceptance from Rav Shali Yisraeli, Beit Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim, one later Rosh Yeshiva, Merkaz HaRav, Rav Waldenberg, who is also a dayan in the Beit Din HaGadol, Rav Ovadia Yosef, and Rav Waldenberg wrote the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Ovadia, of course, Rav Chaim David Halevi, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and similar words were expressed by Rav Herzog, Rav Shlomo Zalman, the Klosenberger Rebbe. They didn't all quote Rav Kook. They said the similar ideas to Rav Kook. You don't need Rav Kook to say all of this. It was obvious in a sense. But he got glowing haskamot. There were, of course, machlokets and debates about the details. Yes, no, maybe in the 30s and 50s, whatever. We'll get about Milchemet Mitzvah, whether or not this is a Milchemet Mitzvah or not. But hindsight is pretty 20/20. And it's clear that we're living the world of Milchemet Mitzvah. You know, and the fact that they wanted to decimate the Jewish people, they want to take Eretz Yisrael back from us. This isn't just, we're going to bother you Jewish people because you're stealing our money. We'll kill a couple of you and we'll walk away. This is as Milchemet Mitzvah as it gets. And we just have to deal with how we can run it without a king. And Rav Yisraeli actually in Amud HaYemini, Siman Zayin, actually expanded on Rav Kook said, and he dealt with much of the details in Rav Kook at great length. And he was Noseh v'Noten. He went up and down. He argued with Rav Kook, and he restored Rav Kook's position a number of times. He argues that a Sanhedrin is not necessary. He brings a raya from Omri, where there was a civil war in the Shomer in Malchut Yisrael. There was a civil war, and Omri won out because of public support. There are two steps in being a king. One of them is the inauguration, the Meshicha, which has its role. But even without that is the public acceptance. You can have Meshicha like David HaMelech or Shaul HaMelech. But before the king, before the country, the nation accepts you, like Shemuel did at the grand inauguration for Shaul. Like David was when he became the king in Hebron after Shaul died. When David moved to Yerushalayim. And when David left from Avshalom, because of Avshalom, he lost his melucha. And he came back, and Ziknei Yehuda accepted him again. And Am Yisrael accepted him again, except Shava ben Michri got in the way. So he had to kill Shava ben Michri, and then the nation accepted him again. Its public acceptance is so critical to the status of a king. We don't allow tyranny. We need the public to accept it. Adoniel rebelled. They said Yechi HaMelech. So what did David HaMelech do? He quickly had Shlomo be anointed at the Gichon in front of everybody, because everyone was at the Gichon. And he paraded him around Yerushalayim. And everyone accepted and understood that Shlomo is the next king. And in place of that, argues Rabbi Yisraeli, you don't have to have a single person when you don't have the kingdom functioning as a kingdom. When you don't have the infrastructure of a kingdom, but you have people. You don't have a Navi and a Sanhedrin anymore. You don't have a Beit HaMikdash. But you can still have people functioning as a king. If the people get together and they accept upon themselves a leader, he takes on the status of a melech, kol inyane haklal, like Rav Kook said. But it doesn't have to be an individual. It could also be a group. It could be a Knesset. It could be a government. In a sense, there are so many people who take upon themselves the status of king. The Medina Yisrael is the Melech. It would be nice if there was a Navi, but it's not necessary. And you might say, wait a minute, the Rambam said, right over here, the king has to be Holich b'derech haTorah v'mitzvos. The Medina is secular, and for many years it was fiercely anti-religious. So how can that be that it has the status of Melech? So Yisraeli argues, read the words after that. Hareze Melech. Hareze Melech, no matter what Rabbi Yisraeli says. But this part about Holich B'derech HaTorah is what leads to this part of Chol Mitzvot HaMalchus Noagod Bo. If you want the kavod of a king, you have to act like a king. Eliyahu Navi ran in front of Achav after the episode at Har Carmel, when Achav did teshuvah for 5 seconds before he went back to his wife, who convinced him to do Avodah Zarah again. But for those 5 seconds that Achav was honoring HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not only did he have a king status of a king, he also got Chol Mitzvot HaMelech Noagod Bo. And Eliyahu Hanavi ran in front of his chariot. Now, there are nafkaminas to this. Once you have a kingdom, you have a malchus, then it doesn't matter how religious or not how religious he is. So you have to believe in you have to follow the law in the Medina, no matter what. Dina de malchuta dina. And the king can take you to Milchamet Har Mitzvah and endanger your life in Milchamet Mitzvah. That's within his jurisdiction. He's not a rodef for doing it. Rabin, arguably, was not a rodef because of this. He was the melech. He had the right to go to the Oslo Accords, and he thought, for whatever reason, right or wrong, doesn't matter, he's in charge. He can make that decision that endangers citizens and endangers soldiers, because that's what happens in war, because he deems that appropriate. And we'll discuss more Be'ezrat Hashem endangering thing another time. Dina de Malchuta Dina. You have to pay your taxes. You have to follow economic policy. Like the king can levy taxes. And Mord b'malchut, for not listening to his commands, except when they call to violate the Torah, is also applicable. And based on that also, it's kibush rabim. When we conquer land, 67 and otherwise, 48, we conquer land, then it takes on the same status as before. This was a sampling, gentlemen, of the idea of having milchamet mitzvah. Today, it is a milchamet mitzvah. And we'll discuss this concept of milchamet mitzvah and many different facets of it throughout the semester. But I'm laying down the groundwork now. Be'ezrat Hashem, in the coming lessons, we'll discuss the forced conscription to the IDF. Our yeshiva Bachrim Pater, Be'ezrat Hashem, B'li Neder, will discuss women as well. And afterwards, we're going to discuss actually fighting a war. Now that we have our army, how do we handle that? With sieging and targeted assassinations, reprisal killings of the 40s and 50s, the civilian casualties of bombing Gaza more indiscriminately this time around than the past 19 years. and they torturing civilians, torturing terrorists to get information, espionage, and all the other great topics that we mentioned, Be'ezrat Hashem, will come. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen v'amen.